Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide.
This evening we are preaching through the Bible, and we're in Job chapter 30. Job's answer to Bildad'S third discourse, part 4, or the Great Depression. Thomas Edison, the prolific American inventor, suffered a devastating loss one night in December 1914. His laboratory and facility were damaged by fire. Most of his projects were destroyed. Almost $1 million worth of equipment was lost. In addition, Edison lost the records of much of his life's work. The next morning, walking about the charred embers of his broken hopes and dashed dreams, the inventor said, "There is value in disaster. All our mistakes are burned up. Now we can start anew." Job had suffered a devastating personal loss like Thomas Edison, only worse. Both lost valuable personal property when least expected. But even worse, Job lost his children and his health. Yet despite this severe loss, Job initially responded with confident faith in God. He understood that God is free to give and to take away, since all belongs to him anyway. In Job chapter 1, verse 20 and 21, "Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." But in the days that followed, his faith wavered and the pain settled in. Weakened and broken, Job poured out his heart to God, seeking relief, even through the escape of death. But no relief was to be found. Nothing could alleviate his pain. In this 30th chapter, Job lamented his sorrowful condition. Having described his happy days of the past in chapter 29, but in this chapter, he cataloged the pains he had suffered before God. He recorded his many areas of personal sorrow, and this chapter portrays a severely depressed man. So first of all, Job's foes despise him, verses 1 through 15. And we'll begin in Job chapter 30 in the first two verses. "But now that they are younger than I, have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. Yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age was perished?" Job is saying that the younger generation mocked him, whereas before he was respected by them. These young people were of poor breeding. Their fathers were not even worth sleeping with Job's sheepdogs. They were of no use to Job, since in old age they were lazy. They were parasites on society. And then verse 3 and 4. "For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste, who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat." So like outcast from society, the fathers of these young people were like wild animals on the prowl, searching for something to get into, looking for trouble. In the brush of the wild, they gathered salt herbs, probably saltwort, a plant which grew in fertile areas. Their food was the root of the juniper tree. This was a plant that grew in the desert and that only the poorest refugees would eat. They lived a meager existence as they foraged for food. And then verse 5 and 6. They were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valleys, in the caves of the earth, and in the rocks. These men were banished from other men, expelled from the society for the common good. They were shouted out by upstanding people as if they were thieves. These exiles were berated by society. They were forced to live in the dry stream beds like animals among the rocks and in the holes in the ground. This was the only habitat suited for these hated outcasts, as they were destitute of a home. Now verse 7 and 8. Among the bushes they brayed. Under the nettles they were gathered together. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. So like wild donkeys they brayed among the bushes, with no one else to associate with but themselves. They huddled in the undergrowth, the thorn bushes. They wasted their lives in idleness. Job described these no-good nomads as a base and nameless brood, not even worthy of names. And further, they did not even need names, since no one was around to call upon them. They were driven out of the land, the scum of society, exiled from the masses. And this scum, the lowest of the low, were now criticizing Job. This put Job at the bottom of the barrel. Verses 9 and 10. And now am I their song? Yea, I am their byword. They abhor me, they flee far from me, and spare not to spit in my face. Now the children of these outcasts were making up dirty little ditties about Job, and they ridicule him in song. They knew what it was to be the subject of derision, or Job knew what it was to be the subject of derision led by young hoodlums. He had become a byword among them, an object of scorn and ridicule. Having a great disdain for Job, they detested him and kept their distance. In fact, they treated him like a leper. They would not approach Job in his cursed state, choosing not to associate with him. Job stated that they did not hesitate to spit in his face, an act of repudiation and disgust. Now verse 11. Because he hath loosed my cord and afflicted me, they have also let loose the bridle before me. Job declared, God has unstrung my bow. He loosed my cord. He believed that God had made him physically weak and demoralized and had afflicted him through all these personal sufferings. In Job's powerless state, people were not afraid to throw off restraint in his presence. All respect for Job was gone. Now verse 12. Upon my right hand rise the youth. They push away my feet, and they raise up against me the ways of their destruction. Like a teenage army against a defenseless city, Job observed that they put out snares for his feet in order to trap him and trip him up. They built their siege ramps against Job so they could destroy him. Their intent was vicious, seeking to take advantage of Job in his weakened state when he was the most vulnerable. Verse 13. They mar my path. They set forward my calamity. They have no helper. Job moaned, they break up my robe, as they prevented him from moving forward with his life. They were succeeding in destroying him, doing great damage to a devastated and defeated man. All this was done against Job without any assistance in this ruthless attack of the youth. Verse 14 and 15, they came upon me as a wide breaking in of waters. In the desolation they rolled themselves upon me. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passeth away as a cloud. They advanced against Job as though a gaping breach in a city wall. Amid the ruins of Job's demolished life, they came rolling in to attack him like an advancing army surrounding him. In the face of this added injury, terrors overwhelm me, Job cried. My dignity is driven away as by the wind, swept away. With his prosperity gone, he lamented, my safety vanishes like a cloud. All that Job owned, both people and possessions, had disappeared without a trace. And not only does Job's foes despise him, but Job's body devastates him. Verses 16 through 19. And we'll initially take up verses 16 and 17. And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. My bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. Did I pronounce sinews right?
Sinews.
Huh?
Sinews.
Say again.
Sinews.
Sinews? Okay. I should have looked it up, but I missed that. Sinews. That makes sense. So feeling his strength all but gone, Job cried, and now my life ebbs away. His sustenance was being poured out of him. Days of suffering gripped him, and he was unable to escape his terrible dilemma. Job could not sleep as the cold night pierced his bones. He could merely lie in bed, but his gnawing pains never rested. Day and night, night and day, the anguish never left him. Haunted by constant nagging, excruciating pain, Job became restless in his frustration. So he says in verse 18 and 19, by the great force of my disease is my garment changed. It bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. He hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. Job could not escape this trauma which he wore like clothing. This is perhaps an allusion to his skin disorder. Job feels that God has bound him like the neck of his garment and refused to loosen his grip. As one already humbled and humiliated by this ordeal, Job acknowledged, he throws me into the mud. This pictures disgrace and shame. I am reduced to dust and ashes, he cried. This symbolized his humiliation and degradation. And not only does Job's foes despise him, and Job's body devastates him, but Job's God deserts him. Verses 20 through 23, beginning in verse 20. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. In the midst of his pain, Job said, I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer. Job felt it was useless to try to secure God's attention. He said, I stand up, and thou regardest me not. God's silence was Job's greatest source of pain. And then verse 21 and 22. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. Job felt as though God was like a violent, angry storm that had overwhelmed his life. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind, he declared. This in spite of his pleas for mercy. Job was being tossed about in the storm, reducing him to nothing. And then we come to verse 23. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. Such an end was now fast approaching, and God, Job believed, was hastening his final day of life. This trial could only lead to an early death, to the place appointed for all of the living. Job had promised himself a long life, but now he saw death at the door. And not only does Job's foes despise him, and Job's body devastates him, and Job's God deserts him, but Job's hope departs from him, verses 24 through 31. Looking at verses 24 and 25, howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Did not I weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? Job said, surely no one lays a hand on a broken man, referring to himself as a crushed and shattered person. Yet this is precisely what his three friends did to him. When Job cried for help, they offered no help. Instead, they acted to hurt him. Job himself had wept for those in trouble. Why had the same sympathy not been extended to him by these three friends? Job's soul grieved for the poor. Why had they not done so for him? And then verse 26, when I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. Job had hoped for good from his friends, but he received only evil. The evil came in their misguided counsel that misrepresented both God and Job. He had looked for light, hope, and kindness, but found darkness, despair, and rejection. And then verse 27 and 28. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of affliction prevented me, held me back. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried in the congregation. Job expressed the emotional exhaustion of his soul. He said, the churning inside me never stops. This emotional pain was provoked by his constant physical pain. Blackened was a term used to denote the disease that was ravaging his body. We'll read about in a moment in verse 30. Or the ash-covered sackcloth that he wore as a symbol of mourning. He would cry for help or relief from the pain, but no relief came. And then verses 29 and 30. I am a brother to a dragon and a companion to owls. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. Because of Job's pain, he wailed like the jackals in the wilderness. Now, I looked up this word dragon, and the best commentators say that he's talking about jackals in the desert, because that's the area that he's talking about. How the jackals will laugh like a hyena, make weird sounds. He said, I'm a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. You ever been out in the woods, Steve, and heard an owl? Hunt?
You hear them up here all the time.
You hear them back there?
Yeah.
Well, we used to have a big old owl that came in right in the tree in our backyard, and little community, South Irving, Kentucky, only had 200 people, had one street, went through town. And a little rural community, and this owl would come and land in a tree. They have a mournful sound. And Job is expressing how he felt. He said, I'm a companion to owls. I remember going hunting early in the morning, going squirrel hunting, getting out early and get under some bushes, and an owl came. I guess it got him stirred up a little bit, and he started making noise, such a sorrowful sound. Job's pain, he wailed like the jackals in the wilderness. He had become a companion of owls, mourning, lonely, and rejected. Rejected by humanity, Job made his abode with the animals. His skin was black and peeling, and his body was burning with intense fever. Job was describing the devastating effect of his disease, which had grown worse. And now in the last verse, verse 31. My harp also is turned to mourning, and my organ into the voice of them that weep. His singing voice is the harp. All he can sing now is the desert blues. The organ is his speaking voice, and he says all he can do is to weep. He has a tear in his voice all the time. That is his condition now. He is asking for sympathy, and certainly is a man to be pitied. George Mueller, known as a great Christian man of prayer, leader in the 19th century, and founded and directed many orphanages in England. But Mueller was also a man who knew tragedy. On February 6, 1870, his wife Mary died of rheumatic fever. In deep pain, Mueller wrote of the tragic event in his diary on the day of her death. 39 years and 14 months ago, the Lord gave me my most valuable, lovely, and holy wife. Her value to me and the blessing God made her to me is beyond description. The blessing was continued to me till this day, when this afternoon, about 4 o'clock, the Lord took her to himself. Then on February the 11th, Mueller wrote, today the earthly remains of my precious wife were laid in the grave. Many thousands of people showed the deepest sympathy. About 1,400 of the orphans who were able to walk followed in the procession. I myself, sustained by the Lord to the utmost, performed the service at the chapel in the cemetery. How was George Mueller sustained through the most difficult time? Surely the secret is found in the text he preached for his wife's funeral. Psalms 119:68. Thou art good, and doest good. Teach me thy statutes. It was this truth, the goodness of God, that carried this great man of faith through his darkest hour. So it will be with us as well. God is good, and he does good. We must all trust him.